The field hospital tent smelled of antiseptic and desert heat. Corporal Reyna Katsaros pressed gauze against the jagged wound on Private Hollis's shoulder, her fingers steady even as the young soldier flinched beneath her touch. The shrapnel had torn through muscle and nicked bone, but she had seen worse. Much worse. "You're going to be fine," she told him, her voice calm and measured. "The bleeding's controlled. You'll be back with your unit in 6 weeks." Hollis nodded, his face pale but trusting. She had that effect on people. Something about the way she moved through crisis with such quiet certainty made even the most terrified soldiers believe her promises. "Katsaros," Staff Sergeant Wade Brennick's voice cut through the tent like a blade. "Briefing in 5. Get yourself cleaned up." She glanced up at him, standing in the entrance, his frame blocking the harsh sunlight that tried to filter through. His arms were crossed, his expression carrying that particular blend of impatience and dismissal she had learned to recognize over the past 8 months serving under him. "I'll be there in 3 minutes," she replied, turning her attention back to Hollis's bandaging. "I need to finish here." Brennick's jaw tightened. "The medic corps can handle it. This briefing isn't optional." She secured the final wrap and met his stare with level composure. "Neither is proper wound care, Staff Sergeant. I'll be there in 3 minutes." He left without another word, but she could feel the disapproval lingering in the air like smoke. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you know someone who served as a combat medic or in a support role that proved more critical than anyone expected. 3 minutes later, Reyna entered the briefing tent where Lieutenant Harlan Voss stood beside a tactical map spread across a folding table. Brennick was already there, along with Specialist Quinn Nakamura and Sergeant First Class Tobias Merrick. The atmosphere was tense with the particular energy that preceded dangerous missions. Lieutenant Voss tapped the location on the map with his index finger. "Intelligence indicates high-value documents at this compound, 15 kilometers northeast of our current position. We insert at 0300, extract the package, and exfiltrate to Point Delta for helicopter pickup." Reyna studied the map, her eyes tracing the terrain features and approach routes. The compound sat in a valley with limited access points and elevated positions on 3 sides. A tactical nightmare if things went wrong. Brennick began assigning roles. "Merrick, you're on point. Nakamura handles communications. I'll lead the extraction team into the compound." "What about Overwatch?" Reyna asked, her finger hovering over the ridgeline to the east. "Those elevated positions could provide enemy advantage if we don't secure them first." Brennick barely glanced at her. "That's not your concern. Your medical support. Stay with the equipment at the insertion point and be ready if someone gets hit. The approach vector leaves us exposed for 200 meters, she continued, ignoring his dismissal. "If we insert here instead, we use this wadi for concealment and cut exposure time by half." Lieutenant Voss looked at the alternate route she indicated, then at Brennick. "Staff Sergeant?" Brennick's expression hardened. "With all due respect to Corporal Katsaros's medical expertise, tactical planning is my job. We use the primary approach. It's been vetted by battalion intelligence." Reyna held his gaze for a moment, reading the subtext clearly. She was the medic. She was supposed to carry the aid bag and stay out of the way. Never mind that she had graduated 3rd in her class at the Army Reconnaissance course before transferring to medical. Never mind the advanced tactical training that most of these men would never see. In Brennick's world, her role was fixed and unchangeable. "Understood," she said quietly, stepping back from the map. Merrick caught her eye with a look that might have been sympathy or might have been acknowledgement, but he said nothing. He never did. Nakamura shifted his weight uncomfortably, his loyalty to Reyna clearly wrestling with his unwillingness to challenge Brennick's authority. Lieutenant Voss continued the briefing, outlining timing, contingencies, and extraction protocols. Reyna listened with the careful attention she brought to everything, noting the gaps in the plan that no one else seemed to see. The insufficient fallback positions, the assumption that intelligence was current and accurate, the overconfidence in a straightforward insertion and extraction. When the briefing ended, the team dispersed to prepare their equipment. Reyna returned to her quarters, a small corner of a supply tent where she kept her gear organized with meticulous precision. Her medical bag was already packed and inventoried, every item in its designated place. But she also checked her rifle, her ammunition, her tactical vest with its spare magazines and emergency equipment. Someone had once told her that being underestimated was a kind of camouflage. She had learned to wear it like armor, letting others see only what they expected while keeping her true capabilities hidden beneath the surface. But camouflage only worked until the moment you needed to be seen. The pre-mission hours passed with the strange combination of urgency and tedium that every soldier knew. Reyna moved through her preparations with practiced efficiency, checking and rechecking her equipment, even though she knew everything was already perfect. The ritual was less about the gear and more about the mental state, the gradual shift from the everyday self into the person who could function under fire. She watched Brennick across the staging area, observing the way he moved among the team with casual confidence. He was a good soldier in many ways, brave, experienced, loyal to his men. But he carried his assumptions like extra armor, and those assumptions had already decided what she was capable of before she ever had a chance to prove otherwise. Nakamura approached her position, his expression uncertain. "Hey, Corporal, I was thinking about what you said in the briefing. About the approach vector." Reyna looked up from the map she had been studying, her own copy marked with notes that Brennick would never see. "What about it? You really think the primary route is exposed?" he asked, lowering his voice as if discussing heresy. She considered her response carefully. "The primary route follows the intelligence assessment. I'm sure Staff Sergeant Brennick has good reasons for trusting it." It was a diplomatic non-answer, and Nakamura recognized it as such. His shoulders sagged slightly. "Yeah, right." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I think you know your stuff. More than people give you credit for." "I appreciate that, Quinn," she replied, using his first name deliberately to soften the formality between them. "Just focus on keeping communications clear tomorrow. That's going to be critical regardless of which route we take." He nodded and moved away, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her map. She traced the terrain features again, memorizing every elevation change, every potential cover position, every choke point where things could go wrong. It was more than preparation. It was the kind of detailed study that came from understanding that knowledge could be the difference between survival and catastrophe. Merrick appeared at her shoulder without warning, his presence announced only by the subtle shift in the air. He had that quality, the ability to move with ghost-like silence despite his solid frame. "You see something the rest of us don't," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Reyna met his gaze and found genuine curiosity there. Not challenge or dismissal. Just see the terrain differently, maybe. Medical training teaches you to think about vulnerabilities, about what can go wrong. "That why you went through reconnaissance school before medical?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. She had never mentioned that training to anyone in this unit. "How did you know about that?" Merrick's expression remained neutral. "I make it my business to know who I'm serving with. Third in your class. Could have had your pick of assignments. But you chose to be a medic instead. That's an interesting choice." Reyna carefully folded her map, buying herself a moment to consider how much to reveal. Saving lives seemed more important than taking them. That's all. He studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see through the simple explanation to the more complex truth beneath. But all he said was, "Well, tomorrow you'll have plenty of opportunity to save lives. Just stay sharp and stay ready." After he left, Reyna sat alone in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into its nighttime rhythm. Generators hummed. Distant voices carried on the desert wind. Somewhere a radio played music too faint to identify. She closed her eyes and ran through the mission profile again in her mind, visualizing each phase, each potential complication, each decision point. At OT 100, the team assembled at the vehicle staging area. Lieutenant Voss conducted a final equipment check, his flashlight beam sweeping across each soldier in turn. When he reached Reyna, his gaze lingered on her medical bag and then shifted to the rifle slung across her chest, the tactical vest with its ammunition pouches, the combat knife strapped to her thigh. "You planning on treating casualties or creating them, Corporal?" he asked with a hint of amusement. "Planning on being prepared for whatever happens, sir," she replied evenly. Brennick stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Katsuros, you're staying at the insertion point with the reserve equipment. You won't need full combat load for that." She met his stare without flinching. "Respectfully, Staff Sergeant, I'll keep my current loadout. Medical protocol requires adequate self-defense capability in hostile territory." It was technically true, though the level of capability she carried exceeded standard medical corps requirements by a considerable margin. Brennick's jaw worked as if chewing on a response he couldn't quite spit out. Lieutenant Voss intervened before the moment could escalate further. "Let's load up," he ordered. "We're on schedule, and I intend to keep it that way." The vehicles rolled out into the darkness, their headlights cutting narrow paths through the vast emptiness of the desert. Reyna sat in the back of the second transport, surrounded by equipment crates and the quiet tension of soldiers approaching danger. Nakamura was beside her, checking his radio equipment for the dozenth time. Across from them, Merrick sat with his eyes closed, not sleeping, but achieving that state of alert rest that experienced soldiers learn to access. Brennick rode in the lead vehicle with Lieutenant Voss, probably discussing final adjustments to the plan, probably reinforcing his tactical decisions, probably never once considering that his medic in the vehicle behind might see angles he had missed. The terrain rolled past in shades of darkness and shadow. Reyna watched it flow by, reading the landscape even in the limited visibility. She noted landmarks, memorized distances, calculated fallback positions that probably would never be needed, but that her training demanded she identify anyway. When they reached the insertion point, the team dismounted with practiced silence and efficiency. The compound was 5 kilometers ahead, invisible in the darkness, but present in everyone's awareness like a magnetic pull. The team moved through the darkness like shadows given purpose. Reyna remained at the insertion point as ordered, surrounded by reserve equipment and spare ammunition crates, watching the others disappear into the terrain ahead. The night vision device mounted to her helmet turned the world into shades of green and black, transforming familiar darkness into something alien and precise. She established a defensive position behind a natural rock formation, her rifle positioned to cover the most likely approach angles. The medical bag sat within easy reach, organized and ready. But her attention was focused on the ridgeline to the east, the elevated position she had warned about during the briefing. Nothing moved there now, but instinct whispered warnings that her training had taught her to trust. Through her radio earpiece, she heard the team's progress reported in terse, professional updates. Merrick on point, calling out terrain features and potential obstacles. Nakamura confirming communications links. Brennick's voice directing movement with confident authority. They were following the primary approach route exactly as planned, moving through that exposed 200-meter stretch that Reyna had identified as vulnerable. She pressed her transmit button. "Overwatch. Any movement on the eastern ridge?" "Negative," Lieutenant Voss responded. "All quiet so far." But quiet was not the same as safe. Reyna scanned the ridgeline again, her enhanced vision searching for any anomaly, any sign that her concerns were justified. The desert landscape remained still, offering no answers. The team reached the compound perimeter 12 minutes into the mission. Through the radio chatter, Reyna tracked their progress as they bypassed security measures and approached the main structure. The intelligence had indicated minimal guard presence, a small security detail protecting what was supposedly a low-priority administrative facility. But the fortifications told a different story to anyone trained to read them properly. The walls were too thick, the security measures too sophisticated, the placement of observation points too strategic. This was not a low-priority target. This was something important enough to disguise as insignificant, which made it far more dangerous than the briefing had suggested. She keyed her radio again. "Be advised, Compound fortifications exceed intelligence estimates. Recommend increased caution. Acknowledged, Lieutenant Voss replied, but his tone carried a hint of impatience at her continued tactical commentary from the rear position. The team breached the main building and moved inside. Radio traffic became more fragmented as they navigated interior spaces, searching for the intelligence package that had brought them into hostile territory. Reyna monitored their progress while simultaneously scanning her own perimeter, dividing her attention between distant teammates and immediate security. Got something? Brennick's voice came through with satisfaction. Looks like encrypted communication device and document case. Package secured. Reyna felt unease settle in her stomach like cold weight. It had been too easy. Intelligence operations this valuable did not sit unguarded in compounds this fortified. Something was wrong with the entire scenario, but articulating that wrongness over the radio would only generate more dismissal of her concerns. Extract, 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 Lieutenant Voss ordered. Primary route back to vehicles. The team emerged from the compound and began their withdrawal. Reyna prepared to collapse her position and move to the pickup point where they would consolidate before returning to base. She was reaching for a medical bag when movement on the eastern ridgeline caught her attention. Figures. Multiple figures. Moving with tactical precision into positions that overlooked the team's withdrawal route. Contact east, she transmitted urgently. Multiple hostiles establishing positions on the ridge. Team is moving into ambush zone. Say again, Brennick demanded. Eastern ridgeline, she repeated, her voice steady despite the adrenaline now flooding her system. Estimate 12 to 15 fighters. They have elevated firing positions covering your route. We don't have visual confirmation, Lieutenant Voss responded. Hold position. But Reyna could see what the team cannot. From her vantage point at the insertion area, she had a clear line of sight to the ridgeline that the team itself could not observe from their lower position. The hostile fighters were moving into a classic ambush formation, waiting for the Americans to enter the kill zone before opening fire. I have visual, she insisted. You need to alter course now. Use the wadi to the south for cover. Katsuros, Brennick's voice was sharp with command authority. You are out of position to assess the tactical situation. Stay off this channel unless you have casualties to report. The words hit her like a physical blow, not because of their harshness, but because of what they represented. Even now, even with enemy forces literally positioning themselves to kill her teammates, her tactical assessment was dismissed because she was the medic. Because Brennick could not reconcile his image of what she should be with the reality of what she was capable of seeing. She watched through her optics as the team continued along the primary withdrawal route, moving steadily toward the ambush that awaited them. Every instinct screamed at her to act, to do something, but military discipline and chain of command held her in place. She was not the tactical leader. She was not the one authorized to alter mission parameters. She was the medic, and medics stayed in their lane. The team entered the exposed section of terrain, that same 200-meter stretch that Reyna had warned about from the beginning. They were completely vulnerable now, caught in open ground with limited cover and enemy fighters positioned above them with superior firing angles. On the ridgeline, she saw movement, weapons being raised, final positioning before engagement. Taking fire, Merrick's voice exploded through the radio, and the night erupted into chaos. Gunfire shattered the desert silence with devastating intensity. Through her night vision, Reyna watched muzzle flashes erupt from the ridgeline like deadly stars, their light painting the darkness in strobing patterns of violence. The team below scrambled for whatever cover they could find in terrain that offered precious little protection. Were pinned down, Lieutenant Voss shouted over the radio, his usual composure cracking under the weight of sudden crisis. Multiple hostiles, elevated positions, heavy fire. Reyna was already moving, her training overriding the standing orders that had confined her to the rear position. She grabbed her rifle and medical bag, leaving the reserve equipment behind as she sprinted toward a position that would give her better angles on both the team and the enemy fighters. Her legs pumped with steady rhythm, her breathing controlled despite the exertion, her mind calculating distances and trajectories with the automatic precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times in training. Katsuros, what are you doing? Brennick's voice demanded through her earpiece. Get back to your position. She ignored him, reaching a rocky outcropping that provided both cover and a clear line of sight to the ambush site. From here, she could see the team scattered among inadequate cover positions, pinned down by sustained fire from above. She could also see the enemy fighters adjusting their aim, walking their fire toward where Nakamura crouched behind a boulder that was slowly being chipped apart by incoming rounds. Her rifle came up smoothly, the scope finding targets with practiced ease. She fired 3 controlled shots at the fighters nearest to Nakamura's position, not aiming to kill necessarily, but to disrupt their concentration and buy the team precious seconds to relocate. 2 of the fighters ducked behind cover, their suppressing fire interrupted. Who's shooting? Mara called out, surprise evident in his voice despite the chaos. Covering fire from Overwatch, Reyna responded calmly, already shifting her aim to the next cluster of enemy positions. Team, move to secondary cover positions while they're disrupted. Brennick's voice cut through again, furious now. Corporal, you're ordered to stand down and return to your assigned position immediately. But Lieutenant Voss, confronted with the reality of effective covering fire versus theoretical command structure, made a tactical decision. All elements displace to better cover. Use the suppression. The team moved with desperate efficiency, using the moment of reduced enemy fire to reach positions that offered more substantial protection. Reyna continued to engage targets on the ridgeline, her shots carefully placed to maximize disruption without exposing her own position for counterfire. It was a delicate balance, providing enough support to matter while maintaining enough concealment to remain effective. Nakamura made it to a dried irrigation ditch that offered solid cover. Merrick reached a cluster of rocks large enough to shield his entire body. Lieutenant Voss and Brennick found protection behind a low wall that had probably once marked a property boundary. The immediate crisis eased slightly, though gunfire continued to crack through the air with lethal intent. We need extraction, Lieutenant Voss transmitted to higher command. Primary extraction point is compromised. Request immediate air support. The response came back cold and final. Negative on air support. Weather front moving in, visibility dropping. Nearest birds are 40 minutes out minimum. 40 minutes might as well have been 40 hours. The team's ammunition would not last that long under sustained engagement. The enemy fighters were already maneuvering to flank their positions, using their superior numbers and knowledge of terrain to pressure the Americans from multiple angles. We have to move, Merrick stated flatly. Staying here is suicide. Brennick scanned the surrounding terrain desperately, his tactical confidence eroding under the weight of a situation spiraling beyond his control. The intelligence had been wrong. The approach had been wrong. His dismissal of Reyna's warnings had been catastrophically wrong. And now his team was paying the price for assumptions that had seemed so reasonable in the safety of the briefing tent. There, Lieutenant Voss pointed toward a wadi system to the south, the same route Reyna had suggested during the original planning. If we can reach that depression, we can use it for covered movement back toward the vehicles. It's 200 meters of open ground, Brennick protested, fear making his voice tight. We don't have a choice, Voss replied. We stay here, we die here. Katsuros, can you provide covering fire during displacement? Reyna assessed angles and ammunition, running calculations that had become second nature through years of training. Affirmative. I can suppress the eastern positions, but you'll need to move fast and move together. On my mark, Voss ordered, his command presence returning as he accepted the only viable option available. 3, 2, 1, move. The team burst from cover in a coordinated dash across open terrain. Reyna opened fire with rapid precision, her rounds impacting near enemy positions in a steady rhythm designed to keep their heads down and their return fire inaccurate. She burned through a magazine, reloaded smoothly without breaking her firing pattern, and continued to provide the suppression that kept her teammates alive during those desperate seconds of exposure. They made it to the wadi, tumbling into the depression with the graceless urgency of soldiers who had just survived what should have been certain death. Reyna ceased fire and assessed her ammunition situation. 3 magazines remaining. Enough for continued engagement, but not enough for sustained combat. All elements sound off, Lieutenant Voss ordered breathlessly. The team reported in one by one, confirming they had made the displacement without casualties. But their situation remained desperate. The enemy fighters were already repositioning to maintain pressure, and the distance back to the vehicles seemed impossibly far. The wadi offered temporary sanctuary, but not safety. Enemy fire continued to crack overhead, the rounds impacting the edges of the depression and sending dirt cascading down on the pinned soldiers below. Lieutenant Voss was on the radio, coordinating with command, trying to arrange any kind of support that might shift the tactical balance back in their favor. But the weather front was rolling in faster than predicted, and the window for air extraction was closing with brutal finality. "We need to keep moving," Merrick stated, checking his ammunition and finding the count distressingly low. "Use this wadi system to put distance between us and those fighters." Brennick studied the intelligence package they had extracted from the compound, the device and documents that had seemed so important an hour ago, but now felt like anchors dragging them toward disaster. His hands shook slightly as he examined the materials, and Reyna recognized the tremor of adrenaline and fear that came when tactical confidence collapsed under the weight of reality. "How's our casualty status?" Lieutenant Voss asked, turning to Reyna with the question that defined her official role in this nightmare. "No wounded yet," she reported, "but that could change quickly if we stay exposed." Nakamura was working his radio, trying to boost signal strength through the interference that seemed to be increasing as the weather deteriorated. He looked young suddenly, stripped of the professional military bearing by the proximity of death and the realization that theoretical training was nothing like the visceral terror of actual combat. The enemy fighters were moving closer. Through gaps in the wadi's edge, Reyna could see their tactical movement, the way they bounded between positions with practiced coordination. These were not amateur insurgents. These were trained soldiers who understood fire and maneuver, who knew how to exploit terrain and maintain pressure on a retreating enemy. "We move in 3 minutes," Lieutenant Voss decided. Traveling order: Merrick on point, Nakamura communications, Brennick and I with the package, Katsuro's rear security. It was a sound decision, placing their most experienced soldier forward and their medic in a position to respond to casualties. But it also meant spreading their combat power thin along a column that would be vulnerable to ambush at multiple points. Reyna wanted to suggest alternatives, wanted to offer the tactical insights that her training provided, but the earlier dismissals had made clear that her input was not welcome in this command structure. "Staff Sergeant," Lieutenant Voss looked at Brennick with expectation. "You agree with this movement plan?" Brennick met his commander's gaze, and something passed between them. Some unspoken acknowledgement of the situation they had created through overconfidence and poor intelligence assessment. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice steadier than his hands. "It's our best option given current circumstances." They prepared to move, conducting final equipment checks and ammunition counts that revealed just how precarious their situation had become. The firefight had consumed more rounds than anyone had anticipated, and the prospect of sustained engagement with limited ammunition added another layer of desperation to an already critical scenario. Katsuro's, Brennick approached her position, his expression difficult to read in the dim light. His voice dropped lower, meant only for her. "When we move, you stay close but stay back. If things go bad, you save yourself first. The mission package is more important than any individual soldier." She held his gaze without responding immediately, recognizing the words for what they were. Not tactical guidance, but insurance. A command structure preparing to sacrifice pieces to save the whole. Her training had covered this scenario, the cold mathematics of triage applied to entire teams instead of individual patients. Save what could be saved. Accept what would be lost. "Understood," she finally said, her voice neutral and professional. They moved out into the darkness, following the Wadi system south, toward where the vehicles waited in a different lifetime, a different mission, a different world than the one they now inhabited. Merrick navigated with steady confidence despite the danger, reading terrain, even in limited visibility, with the instinct of someone who had survived too many similar situations to count. The enemy fighters maintained contact, but at a distance, their harassment fire designed to slow the American withdrawal rather than force decisive engagement. It was a smart tactic. They had time and numbers on their side. They could afford to be patient, letting exhaustion and ammunition depletion do the work that direct assault would accomplish at higher cost. 2 kilometers from the Wadi, the terrain opened into a natural bottleneck where the depression narrowed before widening again. Merrick halted the column, his combat senses warning of danger ahead. "This is bad ground," he transmitted quietly. "Perfect ambush site." "Can we bypass?" Lieutenant Voss asked, already knowing the answer. "Negative. The sides are too steep here. We go through or we go back." Going back meant moving toward the enemy force that was already following their withdrawal. Going forward meant accepting vulnerability through terrain that every tactical manual identified as suicidal. There were no good choices remaining, only degrees of terrible options. "We go through fast," Voss decided. "Minimum interval between soldiers. If contact is made, we fight through rather than getting pinned again." They entered the Narrows in single file, weapons ready and nerves stretched to breaking point. Reyna brought up the rear, walking backward half the time to maintain security on their back trail. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady on her rifle, that curious disconnect between fear and function that defined professional soldiers under fire. They were halfway through when Brennick stumbled, his boot catching on loose stone in the darkness. The sound was small, but in the tense silence it carried like a shout. And in that moment, as if the universe had been waiting for precisely this mistake, everything went catastrophically wrong. The ambush erupted from 3 sides simultaneously, a coordinated assault that spoke of careful planning and professional execution. Muzzle flashes lit the Narrows like strobe lights, transforming the Wadi into a killing ground where every shadow concealed death and every sound carried the promise of violence. The team returned, fired desperately, their training taking over where conscious thought failed. But they were caught in the worst possible tactical position, channeled into a confined space with limited cover and enemy fighters positioned on the high ground above. It was the nightmare scenario that every soldier feared and every commander tried to avoid. "We're cut off," Merrick shouted over the chaos, his rifle barking short controlled bursts at targets that seemed to multiply with each passing second. Front and rear positions occupied. "They boxed us in." Lieutenant Voss was making rapid calculations, his tactical mind racing through options that were all variations of catastrophic. "Break contact left," he ordered, pointing toward a gap in the Wadi wall that might offer escape from the kill zone. "Fighting withdrawal. Move now." The team shifted toward the indicated direction, laying down suppressing fire while attempting to disengage from contact. Nakamura took a round through his radio pack, the equipment exploding in sparks and fragments that showered his back, but miraculously left him physically unharmed. Their communications with higher command died with the radio, severing their last link to support and rescue. Reyna was engaging targets to their rear, trying to prevent the enemy fighters from closing the trap completely. Her ammunition was running critically low, each magazine now carefully rationed as she picked shots with increasing selectivity. 2 rounds to suppress one position, 3 to force another group into cover, always calculating the balance between effectiveness now and capability later. Brennick was struggling with the intelligence package, trying to maintain security on the materials while also fighting for his life. The device had been secured in a protective case, but the documents were loose papers that threatened to scatter in the chaos of movement and combat. He was so focused on preserving the mission objective that he failed to see the enemy fighter rising from concealment directly ahead. "Contact front," Reyna shouted, her rifle already tracking toward the threat. But the angle was wrong, blocked by Brennick's own position. She couldn't take the shot without risk of hitting him. The enemy fighter's weapon came up, the barrel centering on Brennick's chest at point-blank range. Time seemed to stretch and distort. That strange perceptual shift that happened in moments of extreme crisis when the brain accelerated its processing speed in desperate attempt to find solutions that didn't exist. Brennick saw death coming and froze, his body locked in the paralysis of shock and recognition. The fighter's finger tightened on the trigger. And then Merrick was there, his knife flashing in brutal economy of motion that ended with the enemy soldier collapsing silently to the ground. "Keep moving," Merrick growled, already turning to engage the next threat. "Don't stop, don't think, just move." They scrambled out of the narrows and into more open terrain that paradoxically offered better tactical options despite increased exposure. The enemy fire slackened slightly as the fighters adjusted to the changed position, giving the team a brief respite to regroup and assess damage. "Ammunition status," Lieutenant Voss demanded, his voice tight with controlled tension. The reports came back grim. Merrick had 2 magazines remaining. Nakamura had 3, but no functioning radio. Brennick was down to his last magazine, plus his sidearm. And Reyna, despite her careful fire discipline, had burned through her supply, maintaining rear security during the withdrawal. "We can't sustain another engagement like that," Voss stated flatly, speaking aloud the reality everyone already understood. "We need to reach the vehicles before they pin us down again." But the vehicles were still kilometers away, through hostile territory, now fully alerted to their presence. And the enemy fighters were reorganizing for renewed pursuit, their numbers seemingly inexhaustible compared to the dwindling American force. Brennick was checking the intelligence package, his hands still trembling from the close call with death. His fingers moved over the encrypted device, the documents, the materials they had extracted at such terrible cost. Then his expression changed, confusion replacing fear as he examined the papers more closely in the dim light. "Something's wrong," he said quietly, the words carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. "What do you mean wrong?" Lieutenant Voss moved closer, his own attention drawn to whatever Brennick had discovered. "These documents," Brennick held up several pages, his voice thick with dawning horror. "They're marked as decoy materials, deliberately falsified to protect actual intelligence stored elsewhere." The implications settled over the team like physical weight. They had extracted incomplete intelligence. The real package, the actual target of their mission, was still back at the compound they had already fought their way out of. Everything they had endured, every round they had fired, every desperate moment of terror and survival, had been for materials designed to waste exactly this kind of effort. Lieutenant Voss took the papers and examined them himself, his tactical mind already racing ahead to the impossible decision now confronting them. "We can't go back," he said finally. "Not with our current ammunition state and enemy force strength. We extract with what we have and report the situation to command." But Reyna was studying her own mental map of the compound and surrounding terrain, her reconnaissance training automatically analyzing approach routes and infiltration options. The real intelligence would be stored in a more secure location, probably underground or in a hardened structure they had bypassed during the initial extraction. And if the enemy fighters were pursuing the team out here, that meant the compound itself might now be more lightly defended than during their first assault. "I can go back," she said quietly, the words emerging before conscious decision had fully formed. The words hung in the air between them, absurd and desperate and somehow inevitable. 4 faces turned toward Reyna with expressions ranging from disbelief to concern to something that might have been hope trying not to show itself too clearly. "That's insane," Brennick said flatly, finding his voice first. "You'd never make it back alone through hostile territory." But Lieutenant Voss was studying her with a different kind of attention, the look of a commander reassessing assumptions about a subordinate's capabilities. "You went through reconnaissance school," he said, not quite a question. "Third in my class, sir," she confirmed, meeting his gaze steadily. "Advanced infiltration and intelligence gathering. I can move through their lines undetected and extract the real package while they're focused on pursuing this element." Merrick shifted his weight, his tactical mind clearly working through the logistics despite the seeming impossibility of the proposal. "You'd be completely alone out there," he pointed out. "No support, no backup, no extraction if things go wrong." "I understand the risks," Reyna replied, her voice calm despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system from the recent firefight. "But we can't leave the actual intelligence for enemy recovery. And the team can't return in current condition. This is the only option that accomplishes the mission." Nakamura looked between the others, his expression troubled. "Even if she makes it back to the compound, how does she know where to find the real package? We could barely navigate the place the first time with full team support." Reyna pulled out her personal notebook, the small tactical journal she kept despite it not being standard issue for medical personnel. "During our initial breach, I mapped the facility layout," she explained, opening to pages filled with detailed sketches and notes. "There's a secondary structure we bypassed, partially underground. Enhanced security measures, reinforced construction. That's where genuine high-value materials would be stored." Lieutenant Voss examined her drawings with growing respect and perhaps a trace of embarrassment at how thoroughly they had underestimated this soldier. "This is extremely detailed work," he observed. "Medical training emphasizes systematic observation," she replied, the explanation technically true but deliberately incomplete. "I apply those principles to all aspects of field operations." The real question was not whether she could do it, but whether Lieutenant Voss would authorize a solo infiltration mission by a combat medic in a hostile territory to recover intelligence that might not even exist. It violated every protocol, contradicted standard operating procedures, and put a soldier at extreme risk for uncertain gain. But it was also the only tactical option that offered any chance of mission success. "If I authorize this," Voss said slowly, working through the implications, "you go in light and fast. Medical bag stays here. Minimum equipment for mobility and stealth. You have until dawn to extract the package and reach the alternate extraction point. If you're not there by first light, we extract without you." The words were harsh but necessary, the cold mathematics of command that weighed individual lives against mission objectives. Reyna had known these calculations existed in theory. Now, she was experiencing them applied to her own survival with clinical precision. "Understood, sir," she acknowledged. "I'll need one full magazine, my sidearm, and the compound sketches. Everything else stays with the team." Brennick was shaking his head, his earlier dismissiveness transformed into something more complex. "This is my responsibility," he said, the words emerging with difficulty. "I made the tactical errors that created this situation. I should be the one going back." But everyone present understood that Brennick's skills, however considerable in conventional combat operations, did not extend to solo infiltration through hostile territory. Reyna had been trained for exactly this kind of mission. It was what she had excelled at before choosing to become a medic, the skill set she had maintained through private training even when official duties no longer required it. "Staff Sergeant, you're needed to lead this element to extraction," Lieutenant Voss stated firmly, making the decision explicit. "Corporal Katsuros has the specialized training for this operation. We use the assets we have appropriately." It was as close to an apology as military command structure would permit, an acknowledgement that perhaps they should have been using her capabilities more appropriately all along. Brennick recognized the subtext and nodded slowly, accepting both the decision and its implications about his own judgment. Reyna stripped down her gear with practiced efficiency, removing everything that would create noise, weight, or unnecessary bulk. Her medical bag went to Nakamura with instructions for basic trauma care. Her rifle went to Merrick with 2 of her 3 remaining magazines. She kept only her sidearm, knife, 1 magazine for personal defense, and a notebook containing her facility sketches. "You have a watch," Voss confirmed, synchronizing their timepieces. 6 hours until dawn extraction at alternate point Beta. That's your window." She memorized the coordinates, committed the timing to muscle memory, and prepared herself mentally for what came next. The transformation from combat medic to reconnaissance operator was not just physical, but psychological. a shift in mindset from supporting others to relying entirely on her own skills and judgment. "One more thing," Merrick said quietly, pressing something in her hand. "Emergency beacon. If you're compromised beyond recovery, activate it. We'll know you're not coming back." The device was small and cold against her palm, a final insurance policy that would tell her teammates she had failed. She secured it inside her vest without comment, acknowledging the grim necessity without dwelling on its implications. "Good hunting," Lieutenant Voss said simply, the traditional phrase carrying extra weight under current circumstances. Reyna moved out into the darkness alone, leaving behind the team and the security of numbers for the isolation of solo operations. The enemy fighters were still out there, repositioning for renewed assault on her teammates. But she was now moving perpendicular to their focus, slipping through gaps in their attention like water finding paths through stone. The desert landscape transformed under Reyna's solitary passage through hostile territory. What had been merely dangerous terrain became an intimate geography of survival. Every shadow a potential concealment, every sound a data point in the continuous calculation of threat and opportunity. She moved with deliberate patience, prioritizing stealth over speed, knowing that being detected meant mission failure and likely death. The reconnaissance training came back with muscle memory clarity, each movement precise and controlled. She used terrain masking to stay below sight lines, avoided silhouetting herself against the sky, moved during moments when ambient noise would cover the sound of her passage. It was methodical work that required absolute focus and offered no margin for error. An enemy patrol passed within 30 meters of her position, for fighters moving with casual confidence through territory they controlled. She remained motionless in a shallow depression, controlling her breathing, becoming part of the landscape through sheer force of will and training. They walked past without pause, their conversation carrying on the night air in a language she didn't speak, but whose tone conveyed routine security rather than heightened alert. After they passed, she waited another 5 minutes before moving again, the discipline of patience that separated professionals from amateurs. Rushing now would waste everything the caution had purchased. She had time. Not much, but enough if she used it wisely. The compound appeared gradually through the darkness, its structures familiar from the earlier assault, but transformed by new perspective and solitary approach. She could see the main building they had breached, still showing signs of their passage in disturbed doors and scattered equipment. But her attention focused on the secondary structure she had noted during initial reconnaissance. The partially underground facility with its reinforced construction and enhanced security measures. 2 guards stood at the entrance, alert but not expecting trouble from the direction of their own territory. The main American force was being pursued in the opposite direction, drawing attention and resources away from this location. It was exactly the tactical opportunity she had anticipated, the gap in defensive posture created by enemy confidence and divided focus. Reyna circled wide around the compound perimeter, using a dried stream bed for concealed approach. Her progress was measured in meters per minute, each movement carefully planned and executed. She reached a position that offered direct line of sight to the secondary structure entrance, studying the guard patterns and identifying their rotation schedule. They changed position every 20 minutes, one guard walking a brief patrol while the other remained stationary at the door. The patrol route was predictable, following the same path each cycle with the mechanical regularity of soldiers performing routine duty. It was a vulnerability she could exploit, but only once and only if timing was perfect. She waited through 2 complete guard rotations, confirming the pattern and looking for variations that might indicate heightened awareness. But the guards were relaxed, their body language speaking of boredom rather than vigilance. The main threat was being pursued elsewhere. This facility was secure, unimportant, forgotten in a larger tactical situation. On the 3rd rotation, as the mobile guard moved to the farthest point of his patrol route, Reyna advanced. She covered 20 meters of open ground in absolute silence, reaching the compound wall and pressing flat against its surface. The stationary guard was 15 meters away, his attention focused outward toward potential external threats rather than the secure area behind him. She moved along the wall with careful steps, closing the distance while the mobile guard was still out of sight around the building corner. Her knife was in her hand, the blade reflecting no light in the darkness. 10 meters. 5 meters. The guard shifted his weight, beginning to turn in her direction, and she accelerated the final distance with explosive speed that gave him no time to react or raise alarm. The engagement was silent and brutally efficient, her training manifesting in movements practiced 10,000 times until they became automatic. The guard went down without sound, his weapon secured before it could clatter against stone. She dragged him in a shadow and zip-tied his hands and feet, stuffing cloth into his mouth to prevent noise if he regained consciousness. The mobile guard would return in approximately 3 minutes. She had that long to breach the facility entrance and disappear inside before his partner's absence triggered alarm. The door was secured with electronic lock, more sophisticated than the main building, but still vulnerable to someone who understood the systems. She examined the lock mechanism, recognizing the model from her technical training. It required authorization code or biometric scan, neither of which she possessed. But it also had a maintenance override accessible through the control panel, a backdoor meant for technicians that became a security vulnerability in the right hands. 2 minutes remaining. Her fingers worked quickly, removing the panel cover and accessing the internal wiring. She bypassed the primary authorization circuit and triggered the maintenance override, holding her breath as the mechanism processed the unauthorized command. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed thunderously loud in the quiet night. She slipped inside and secured the door behind her, leaving it locked from within to slow any pursuit. The interior was dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting everything in shades of red that preserved night vision while providing enough illumination to navigate. She was in a corridor leading deeper underground, exactly as her tactical assessment had predicted. The facility was smaller than the main building, but more secure, its construction speaking of genuine importance rather than administrative facade. She moved through the space with careful attention, mapping layout and identifying potential intelligence storage locations. Most rooms were empty or contained equipment of obvious low value. But at the corridor's end was a vault door with biometric security and physical locks that marked it as containing genuinely critical materials. The vault door represented a significant obstacle. Its security measures far beyond what could be bypassed with simple technical manipulation. Reyna studied the system carefully, her mind racing through options that range from difficult to nearly impossible. The biometric scanner required authorized handprint and retinal scan. The physical locks needed specific keys, and the entire mechanism was likely connected to silent alarm systems that would trigger if she attempted forced entry. She checked her watch. 4 hours until dawn extraction. Time was becoming a factor, the comfortable margin of error eroding with each passing minute. She could retreat now, with mission incomplete, but personal safety relatively secure. Or she could push forward into unknown risk for uncertain gain. The decision was not really a decision at all. She had come too far, risked too much, left her team in too much danger to turn back because the final obstacle was difficult. She would find a way through this door, or she would fail trying, but retreat was not among the options she was willing to consider. A sound from the corridor above made her freeze. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving with purpose rather than patrol routine. The missing guard had been discovered. The facility was being searched. Her window of opportunity was collapsing faster than she had calculated. She moved quickly to a side room, finding cover behind equipment racks while voices echoed through the underground space. The searchers were methodical, checking each room systematically as they worked toward her position. She counted at least 4 distinct voices, possibly more. Too many to engage with her limited ammunition and no support. The searchers reached the vault area, their voices rising in alarm as they confirmed the presence of an intruder. Orders were shouted in urgent tones, security protocols activated, backup summoned. The compound was shifting from routine operations to active defense faster than she could adapt to the changing situation. But in their rush to secure the vault, the enemy soldiers had made a crucial error. One of them carried keys on his belt, the physical components needed to access the vault's mechanical locks. She could see them clearly from her concealment position, dangling within potential reach if she could create the right opportunity. The soldiers were clustered near the vault door, arguing about whether to open it and verify contents or maintain security seal until higher authority arrived. Their attention was focused inward on the debate, their weapons lowered in the false security of interior space among allies. It was a tactical mistake born of assumption, the same kind of error that had plagued her own team's operations throughout this entire mission. Reyna drew her sidearm and aimed carefully at the overhead lighting, taking a moment to calculate angles and consequences. The shot would be loud, would immediately reveal her presence, would commit her to direct engagement against superior numbers, but would also create confusion and darkness, temporary advantages that might be enough if she moved with absolute decisiveness. She fired 3 rapid shots, each round destroying a light fixture and plunging sections of the corridor into darkness. The enemy soldiers reacted with predictable shock, their night vision destroyed by the transition from illumination to blackness, their weapons coming up in defensive postures against an unseen threat. Reyna was already moving, using their moment of blindness to close distance with explosive speed. She reached the soldier with the keys and struck him precisely in the nerve cluster below his ear, dropping him instantly to unconsciousness. The keys came free from his belt as she continued moving, never stopping, using momentum and surprise to stay ahead of enemy response. Gunfire erupted behind her as the soldiers recovered enough to shoot at movement and shadow. Rounds impacted walls and equipment with sharp cracks that sent fragments flying through the confined space. She dove into another side room, rolled behind cover, and returned fire to keep them suppressed while she processed her new tactical situation. She had the keys. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they organized effective response. And she had 1 magazine in her pistol against at least 4 armed opponents who were now fully alert and hunting her with lethal intent. The vault was 10 meters away, through a corridor now filled with enemy soldiers. Reaching it directly was impossible, but she had noticed during her initial reconnaissance that the facility had ventilation ducts, necessary for underground structures to maintain breathable air. The ducts were small, but she was smaller, trained to move through confined spaces during her reconnaissance coursework. She fired twice more to maintain suppression, then moved to the ventilation grate in her current room. The screws came out quickly under her knife blade, the grate lifting free to reveal a narrow shaft that led deeper into the facility's infrastructure. She squeezed inside, pulling the grate loosely back into place behind her, and began crawling through darkness toward where the vault room should be located. The duct was barely wide enough for her shoulders, the metal surface cold against her skin where uniform fabric had torn during entry. She moved by feel and mental map, counting distance and angle changes, hoping her spatial reasoning was accurate enough to reach the right destination. Behind her, she could hear the soldiers discovering her escape route, their voices raised in frustration and grudging respect for her tactical improvisation. The duct opened into a small mechanical room adjacent to the vault chamber. She emerged covered in dust and minor abrasions, but intact and undetected. The mechanical room shared a wall with the vault, and through that wall she could hear the soldiers outside, still searching the main corridor for an intruder they assumed was mobile and armed. She examined the shared wall, looking for weakness or access. The construction was solid but not impenetrable, designed to separate functional spaces rather than provide security. At floor level, she found what she needed, a maintenance access panel that connected the mechanical systems between rooms. It was secured but not locked, meant for technician convenience rather than security barrier. The panel opened silently, revealing a gap just large enough for her to squeeze through into the vault room itself. She was inside the most secure location in the facility, bypassing all its sophisticated security through simple mechanical access that no one had considered a vulnerability. The vault room was smaller than she had anticipated, perhaps 3 meters square with reinforced walls and a single steel table holding exactly what she had come to retrieve. Document cases, encrypted storage devices, tactical maps with operational planning details that would be invaluable to intelligence analysts. This was the real target, the genuine high-value materials that justified the entire mission and all the risks they had endured. Reyna moved quickly, gathering everything into a tactical bag she had brought specifically for this purpose. The materials were heavy but manageable, compact enough to carry during exfiltration if she could find a way out of the facility and back through hostile territory. She photographed everything with a small camera from her vest, creating backup documentation in case the physical materials were lost during escape. Outside the vault, she could hear the soldiers reorganizing, their search becoming more systematic as initial panic transformed into professional procedure. They would eventually realize the ventilation ducts provided access routes. They would eventually search the mechanical spaces. Her time inside this room was measured in minutes, perhaps less. She examined the vault door from the interior side, finding it could be opened from within using a manual release lever. It was a safety feature required by building codes, ensuring people could not be trapped inside during emergencies. But using it would immediately alert everyone to her location and trigger direct confrontation. She could not win with limited ammunition against multiple opponents. The alternative was returning through the maintenance access and ventilation system, retracing her infiltration route in reverse. It would be slower, more vulnerable to discovery, but offered potential for stealth that the direct approach eliminated entirely. She made the decision quickly, committing to extraction through the ducts despite the claustrophobic danger and uncertain outcome. She secured the tactical bag across her body, checked that her pistol was easily accessible, and squeezed back through the maintenance panel into the mechanical room. The ventilation grate was where she had left it, slightly displaced, but not obviously disturbed. She was about to enter the duct when voices outside the mechanical room door made her freeze. 2 soldiers were discussing search procedures, their tones suggesting they were about to check this exact space. She had perhaps 10 seconds before they entered and discovered her presence. The duct was too far to reach before they would have line of sight. The room offered minimal cover and no alternate exits. She positioned herself beside the door where it would swing open, pressing flat against the wall in the narrow gap created by the door's arc. It was desperate concealment that would fail if they entered fully or turned the lights brighter, but it was the only option available in the seconds remaining. The door opened and 1 soldier entered, his weapon raised, but his attention focused forward into the room rather than checking immediate corners. His partner remained in the doorway providing cover, their tactical positioning sound but not accounting for threats already inside their security perimeter. Reyna struck the entering soldier in the throat with precise force, dropping him gagging and helpless to the floor. She grabbed his weapon as he fell, bringing it to bear on his partner before the second man could process what had happened. They faced each other across 3 meters of space, both armed, both capable, both understanding that the next second would determine who survived and who didn't. "Lower your weapon," she said in clear English, her voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I don't want to kill you, but I will if necessary." The soldier hesitated, his training warring with his survival instinct. He could see her stance, professional and steady. He could see his partner on the floor, clutching his damaged throat. He could calculate odds that were not in his favor despite being on his own territory, surrounded by allies. He lowered his weapon slowly, setting it on the ground and raising his hands. Reyna gestured for him to move into the room, maintaining distance and angle that kept him covered while she retrieved his rifle. She zip-tied both soldiers, securing them thoroughly, but not cruelly. 2 more pieces removed from the tactical equation. The encounter had cost her precious time, but gained her a rifle with full magazine, significantly improving her combat capability for the extraction ahead. She checked the weapon quickly, confirming its functionality and familiarizing herself with its controls. It was a model she had trained on, another small advantage in a situation where every edge mattered. She entered the ventilation duct again, moving faster now despite the cramped quarters. Speed was becoming more important than stealth as the facility's security response intensified. She could hear increased activity throughout the compound, more soldiers being mobilized, search procedures expanding to cover areas initially overlooked. The duct brought her back to the original infiltration point, emerging into the room where she had first taken cover. The corridor beyond was now empty, the soldiers having moved their search deeper into the facility based on the mechanical room encounter. It was a temporary gap in coverage that would not last long, but might be enough for someone willing to exploit it decisively. Reyna moved to the facility exit, checking the door carefully for signs of external security. 2 soldiers were visible outside, positioned to prevent escape, but not expecting someone to actually attempt it. They were alert but not prepared, watching outward for approaching threats rather than monitoring the door they guarded. She pushed the door open smoothly, stepping out with the captured rifle raised and ready. The soldiers spun toward the sound, recognizing too late that the threat was already among them. She fired twice with precise economy, not aiming to kill, but to disable, her rounds impacting knees and sending both men down in shock and pain. She was outside, carrying the intelligence package and most of her ammunition intact. The compound was behind her, the desert ahead, and somewhere in the darkness her team was waiting at an extraction point that seemed impossibly far away. 3 hours until dawn. 20 kilometers of hostile territory to cross. And every enemy fighter in the area now alert to an American operator moving alone through their controlled space. The extraction route was a nightmare of calculated risk and desperate improvisation. Reyna moved through hostile territory with every skill she possessed pushed to its absolute limit, navigating by memory and stars while avoiding enemy patrols that seemed to materialize from the darkness with alarming frequency. The compound behind her had erupted into full alert, lights blazing and vehicles mobilizing to hunt the intruder who had penetrated their most secure facility. She used terrain masking and tactical patience, sometimes remaining motionless for 20 minutes while patrols passed within meters of her position. The intelligence package weighed heavy across her shoulders, physical reminder of why she had come back and what she was risking to complete this mission. Failure now would mean not just her own death, but the loss of critical intelligence and the sacrifice of everything her team had endured. 2 hours from dawn, she encountered an enemy checkpoint that blocked the most direct route to the extraction point. For soldiers manning a vehicle barrier, equipped with radios and weapons, and the comfortable confidence of men operating deep inside secure territory, bypassing them would add significant time and distance to her route. Going through them was tactically insane, but potentially faster. She studied the checkpoint from concealment, mapping sight lines and reaction times, looking for weakness in their defensive posture. They were alert, but not paranoid, watching for vehicles approaching on the road rather than individual operators moving through adjacent terrain. Their attention was focused outward toward potential threats, not inward toward the secure area they thought they occupied. Reyna circled wide around the checkpoint, using a dry creek bed for concealed movement until she was positioned behind their defensive line. From here, she could see their entire setup, the gaps in their coverage, the assumptions built into their security posture. It was the same pattern she had seen throughout this operation. Defenders who controlled territory but couldn't imagine threats originating from unexpected vectors. She moved into position directly behind the checkpoint, so close she could hear their casual conversation and smell tobacco smoke from their cigarettes. One soldier was complaining about being pulled from sleep for alert duty. Another was speculating about what had triggered the compound alarm. They were human and tired and unprepared for what was about to happen. She emerged from concealment at a dead run, covering the final 15 meters before their awareness could translate into reaction. The closest soldier went down from a rifle, but to the base of his skull, unconscious before he hit the ground. The second soldier managed to turn and raise his weapon, but her knife was already in motion, disarming him with brutal efficiency and leaving him bleeding but alive on the desert floor. The remaining two soldiers recovered from their shock and opened fire, their rounds cracking past her position as she dove behind their vehicle for cover. She returned fire through the undercarriage, her shots precisely placed to wound rather than kill, continuing the pattern of tactical mercy that marked her entire infiltration. Both soldiers went down screaming, their leg wounds severe but survivable if they received medical attention. She secured their weapons and disabled their vehicle, actions performed with automatic precision born of training that had become instinct. The checkpoint was neutralized, her route forward clear, but the gunfire had announced her location to every enemy element within hearing distance. Speed now mattered more than stealth, distance more than concealment. Reyna ran through the darkness carrying the intelligence package and captured rifle, her legs pumping with steady rhythm despite exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm physical conditioning. She could hear vehicles mobilizing behind her, enemy quick reaction forces responding to the checkpoint engagement. They would follow her trail, intercept her route, place themselves between her current position and the extraction point where her team waited. The terrain began to rise, rocky outcroppings providing both cover and obstacle as she climbed toward higher ground. Her breath came harder now, the altitude and exertion combining with accumulated stress to push her body toward its limits. But she had trained for exactly this scenario, the lonely miles of running with heavy pack, the endless exercises that prepared soldiers for moments when quitting meant dying. She reached a ridgeline and paused briefly to assess her backtrail. Vehicle lights were visible in the distance, multiple sets converging on her last known position. They would find the disabled checkpoint, track her direction, calculate possible destinations. She had perhaps 30 minutes before they could position forces to cut off her escape. The alternate extraction point was visible in the valley below, a dry lake bed that offered flat, open terrain suitable for helicopter landing. And there, positioned at the designated coordinates, she could see the unmistakable signatures of her team. For figures maintaining security perimeter, waiting for extraction or confirmation of her death. They had made it through enemy pursuit and reached the fallback position. Now everything depended on whether she could cover the final distance before dawn and enemy interception. She descended the ridge with controlled haste, trading some caution for necessary speed. The terrain was treacherous in darkness, loose stone and hidden obstacles that could turn an ankle or cause catastrophic fall. But she navigated with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning to read ground, even in limited visibility. Halfway down the slope, her boots slipped on gravel, and she fell hard, tumbling several meters before arresting her slide against a boulder. Pain flared in her ribs where the intelligence package had impacted during the fall, sharp enough to suggest cracked bone, but not severe enough to indicate complete break. She forced herself upright, checking that the package was intact and undamaged, then continued downward with renewed caution born of painful lesson. The valley floor was 200 meters ahead when the first enemy vehicle crested the ridge she had just ascended. Searchlights swept the terrain in broad arcs, hunting for the American operator who had caused such chaos behind their lines. She broke into a sprint despite her injuries, covering open ground with desperate speed while those lights sought to find and fix her position for engagement. The searchlights found her 50 meters from the team position, illuminating her running form against the desert floor like an actor spotlighted on stage. Gunfire erupted immediately, rounds impacting around her feet and sending up geysers of sand and stone. She zigzagged desperately, using every evasion technique she knew while maintaining forward momentum toward the team that was now returning fire to cover her final approach. Merrick's rifle barked with steady rhythm, each shot precisely placed to disrupt enemy aim without wasting ammunition. Nakamura was beside him providing supporting fire while Lieutenant Voss coordinated their defensive response. And Brennick, positioned at the perimeter's edge, was shouting for her to move faster, his voice carrying genuine fear for her survival rather than command authority. She covered the final meters in a diving roll that brought her behind their defensive line, gasping for breath and bleeding from a dozen minor wounds accumulated during the night's operations. The intelligence package was intact against her body, the materials she had risked everything to recover still secure despite the chaos of extraction. "You made it," Lieutenant Voss said, his voice carrying equal parts relief and disbelief. "You actually made it. Package secured," she replied between labored breaths, her training maintaining professional bearing even in extremity. Complete intelligence materials plus enemy tactical planning documents recovered from the vault. Vrennik was staring at her with an expression that combined shame and wonder and something approaching reverence. "When I gave the order to move out," he said quietly, "when I left you behind, I thought you were dead. I thought I had killed you with that decision." She met his gaze steadily, seeing the weight of command responsibility and tactical error that had been crushing him for hours. "You made the call you thought was right with the information available, Staff Sergeant. That's all any leader can do. But I was wrong," he continued, needing to say the word aloud. "About the approach, about your tactical assessment, about your capabilities. I was wrong about all of it, and good soldiers almost died because of my assumptions." The distant helicopter sound interrupted their conversation, the distinctive thump of rotor blades announcing the arrival of their extraction bird. Dawn was breaking across the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed too beautiful for the violence they had endured through the night. The helicopter landed in swirling dust, its crew chief gesturing urgently for the team to board. Enemy vehicles were visible on the ridgeline now, close enough that their occupants could observe the extraction, but too far to effectively engage. The Americans had reached safety by margins too narrow to calculate, survival measured in seconds and meters rather than comfortable tactical buffers. They loaded aboard with practiced efficiency, each soldier finding their place in the cargo area while the pilot lifted off immediately. Reyna collapsed into a seat, finally allowing exhaustion to overwhelm the adrenaline that had sustained her through impossible operations. The intelligence package rested on her lap, tangible proof that the mission had succeeded despite every obstacle and error. Lieutenant Voss was on the radio, reporting their status to higher command, confirming successful extraction of personnel and recovery of high-value intelligence materials. His words were professional and concise, giving no indication of the desperate hours that had preceded this moment of relative security. Nakamura offered her water and a protein bar, the simple gestures of care that soldiers showed each other after surviving crisis together. She accepted both gratefully, her hands shaking slightly now that immediate danger had passed. Merrick was checking her visible injuries with clinical attention, his combat medic training allowing him to assess damage even without her medical bag. "You're going to need stitches on that arm," he observed, examining a laceration she hadn't even noticed during the infiltration. "Probably cracked ribs on your left side. And you look like you haven't slept in about 3 days." "Sound about right," she agreed, managing a tired smile despite the pain. The helicopter crossed back into friendly territory, the psychological boundary marked by increased radio chatter and visible friendly patrols on the ground below. They were safe now, truly safe, the mission completed and the team intact despite odds that should have destroyed them. At the forward operating base, Captain Iris Drummond was waiting on the landing pad with intelligence officers and medical personnel. She watched the team disembark, her experienced eye noting their condition and reading the story of their operation in visible wounds and exhausted bearing. Lieutenant Voss rendered a crisp salute despite his fatigue. "Mission accomplished, ma'am. Intelligence package recovered and team extracted with no casualties." Captain Drummond returned the salute and then shifted her attention to Reyna, who stood holding the tactical bag containing materials that would be analyzed by specialists and incorporated in a broader operational planning. "Corporal Katsuros," she said formally, "I understand you conducted a solo infiltration operation to recover these materials after the initial extraction proved incomplete." "Yes, ma'am," Reyna confirmed, standing as straight as her injuries allowed. The compound vault contained the actual high-value intelligence. I was able to access the facility and secure the materials while enemy forces were engaged pursuing the main team element. Captain Drummond took the tactical bag personally, acknowledging the weight of what it represented and who had carried it through hostile territory. "I've been briefed on your background," she continued. "Reconnaissance school honors, tactical training that exceeds most infantry specialists, medical expertise that saved lives during this operation. That's an unusual combination of capabilities, Corporal. I believe in being prepared for whatever the mission requires, ma'am," Reyna replied simply. The captain studied her for a long moment, then glanced at Lieutenant Voss and Staff Sergeant Brennick. "It seems this team has learned something about utilizing all available assets appropriately," she observed. "I'm recommending Corporal Katsuros for immediate promotion and assignment as tactical advisor in addition to her medical responsibilities. We need soldiers who can operate across multiple specialties, especially in complex operational environments." Brennick stepped forward, his bearing formal, but his voice carrying genuine respect. "If I may speak, ma'am, Corporal Katsuros saved this mission and this team through capabilities I failed to recognize or utilize effectively. Any commendation she receives is deserved many times over." Captain Drummond nodded acknowledgement, then addressed the entire team. "You all performed with distinction under circumstances that would have destroyed lesser units. Get medical attention, get rest, and prepare for debrief at 1400 hours. Dismissed." As the team dispersed toward medical facilities and barracks, Reyna found herself walking beside Brennick. He was quiet for several steps, then spoke with difficulty. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for dismissing your input, for leaving you behind, for failing to see what you were capable of until circumstances forced the recognition." She considered her response carefully, understanding that this was about more than one operation or one command relationship. "We all have assumptions, Staff Sergeant. The measure of a good leader is what they do when those assumptions prove wrong. You authorized the solo infiltration when it was the only option that made tactical sense. That took courage and trust that I appreciate. If you enjoyed the story, drop a comment and let us know your favorite moment, or share if you've witnessed someone prove their worth when others had given up on them." The team continued forward together, transformed by crisis into something stronger than what they had been before. Reyna Katsuros was no longer just the combat medic who stayed in her lane. She was the soldier who had been left in the kill zone and returned carrying not just intelligence materials, but proof that expertise came in unexpected forms, that assumptions were dangerous, and that every team member deserved recognition for their complete capabilities rather than limited definitions of their roles.